Repairs on Franklin's old London house turned up 1,200 pieces of bone from at least 15 people.
Underneath the home of an American founding father lay a haunting secret that remained hidden for 200 years.
My initial reaction was with what we got here. I'd never seen bones in a house like this before. I saw what I believe to be the remains of more than one person. Certainly one skull, a number of major bones of the body.
Buried under time and a pile of earth were bones belonging to children, teenagers, and adults. Who were these people? And why were their bones found deep under the house that Benjamin Franklin lived in?
Could it be that Benjamin Franklin was involved with murder? I mean, we didn't know, and we had to find out.
This will challenge everything you know about one of America's founding fathers. Come with us to learn about a part of history you may never see.
They can literally make a killing off the dead.
It was just absolutely disgusting.
The quiet house on Craven Street. Something old is stirring beneath one of London's quietest streets, and most people walking past never sense the weight of what lies under their feet. The truth hidden here is not loud, but once you notice it, it changes how you see the past entirely. This story begins on Craven Street, a narrow lane pressed between the grand stone buildings of central London, where number 36 stands without asking for attention. It looks like any other Georgian townhouse. Weathered brick, tall windows, a facade shaped by centuries of London air, and yet almost every visitor who finds their way here is chasing one name: Benjamin Franklin, the printer, inventor, diplomat, and one of America's founding fathers. He first stepped onto this street in 1757, carrying the kind of political pressure that could collapse a lesser man. London was the heart of an empire, and he walked into it with ideas that would one day ignite a revolution. His face now sits on currency, his experiments fill science books, and his sharp humor still circulates through classrooms and quotation lists. But between 1757 and 1775, this modest house became his refuge in the capital. The property belonged to Margaret Stevenson, a widow who kept a respectable home and offered Franklin rooms on the upper floors. Here he wrote by candlelight, welcomed visitors, and managed colonial business with that careful blend of wit and calculation that made him famous. The rooms still stand, quiet and unchanged, as if waiting for him to return. Nothing in the building's appearance hinted at secrets, nothing warned of anything darker than ordinary life. But buildings keep memories long after people let them fade. This one carries the shape of 18th century living. Narrow staircases winding upward, small rooms branching from dim corridors, and a basement sunk below street level, the kind of cool, shadowed space every house of that era relied on for storage and daily work. For 200 years after Franklin left, the house moved through quiet transformations. It became apartments, then offices, then a forgotten structure as modern London rose around it. Even then, the exterior revealed nothing. No plaque hinted at mysteries, no crack in the brickwork suggested a hidden chapter. The house simply aged, as houses do. Yet under the worn floors, in the stillness of that basement, something waited. Something that would one day shift this quiet address from a historical footnote into the center of a puzzle that newspapers would call the Benjamin Franklin House Horror. Something that would push historians to ask difficult questions about what might have happened here while one of America's most celebrated figures lived just a floor above. And the turning point came not from careful research, but by pure accident. Once uncovered, it opened a chapter Franklin never wrote in his meticulous records, a chapter the house had been holding in silence for centuries. The renovation that changed everything. By 1998, the Benjamin Franklin house wasn't aging. It was giving way. Decades of neglect had hollowed it out until the walls leaned like they were tired of holding history. The Benjamin Franklin House Trust stepped in with one mission: save what time was trying to erase. The plan sounded simple enough: stabilize the structure, restore the Georgian features, and shape a museum worthy of one of America's giants. Teams arrived with tools, blueprints, and the usual expectations: cracked mortar, swollen wood, stray pottery shards, maybe a clay pipe or two. Nothing dramatic, nothing mysterious. But the basement demanded special attention. Dampness had chewed at the foundation for years, and the floor levels needed urgent correction. Then came the moment everything shifted. As workers dug into the basement floor to shore up weak points, a shovel struck something it shouldn't have. A small pit, carved deliberately, yet hidden under layers of packed earth. Maybe they expected an artifact from Franklin's era. But what they found didn't belong to any tidy museum display. Half buried in the soil lay a single bone, dirt-cloaked and pale from years in the dark. Probably an animal, the workers thought at first. London is old, and the ground is full of surprises. But when they kept digging, carefully this time, and another bone surfaced. Then another, and another. Different sizes, different shapes. And soon the pile beside them grew too large to dismiss. These weren't scattered leftovers from the city's past. They were placed. Deliberately. Quietly. The pit had been filled with intention. As the team cleared more earth, the scope widened. Larger bones, smaller ones, pieces from every region of the body, and then fragments of skulls. All human. The count climbed quickly, dozens, then hundreds, as the workers marked the spread of the deposit. By the end of the excavation, more than 1,200 human bone fragments had been removed, representing about 15 individuals, all buried, concealed, and forgotten for over 2 centuries. Within days, the restoration site changed completely. Police arrived, work halted, tape went up, specialists were brought in. What had begun as a historical rescue had morphed into a forensic investigation, and the quiet house on Craven Street didn't feel quiet anymore. The first questions. Word traveled fast through the offices and institutions that shape London. First came the police, then the coroners, then the archaeologists and historians, summoned as if the past itself had blown a whistle. They crowded into Craven Street with one question tumbling over the next. Had they uncovered victims of murder? Was this evidence of a long-hidden predator operating in the heart of historic London? And beneath every question lurked a heavier one. What, if anything, tied Benjamin Franklin to what lay beneath his old home? Nothing about the scene offered comfort. The remains hadn't washed in from an old burial ground or wandered in from nearby structures. Someone had deliberately and purposefully placed them here, inside this very basement, during one specific slice of history. And the dates aligned with unsettling accuracy. While Benjamin lived and worked upstairs, the bodies were secretly interred below. Preliminary reports only tightened the knot. Many remains belonged to children, some heartbreakingly young. Across all eras, children's deaths carry a weight that darkens everything around them. Who were they? The forgotten poor? Abandoned youths claimed for someone's hidden purpose? London had seen shadows like this before. Burke and Hare had fed the anatomy trade in Edinburgh, only decades after Franklin's time. Could something similar have unfolded here, undetected and unrecorded? Modern specialists approached the scene with tools the 18th century could never have dreamed of. High-resolution imaging, systematic cataloging, and forensic analysis executed piece by piece. But instead of clarity, the evidence delivered deeper questions. Some bones bore traces of precise cutting. They were clean, deliberate, and executed at joints with exactness. Not frantic destruction, not blind violence. This was controlled, practiced, almost clinical. Then came another anomaly. Several skulls carried circular drill holes, perfectly shaped, symmetrical openings made by intentional technique. Not impact, not random damage. Planned, measured. But why drill into human skulls at all? The list of explanations was short, and none of them comforting. Ritual, research, something even harder to name. Headlines exploded overnight. Franklin's House of Horrors. The Craven Street Secret. Reporters filled the pavement as investigators fought to stay ahead of speculation. The public wanted answers. The mystery only grew. But buried among the fragments was a subtle, consistent, and revealing pattern. A pattern that began to suggest something other than murder. Something controversial, yes, but rooted in the scientific world of Franklin's era. Something that might explain not only how these bones arrived here, but why. And those revelations would reshape the entire investigation. The start of a scientific rat race. The specimens were transferred to specialist labs where osteologists and historical archaeologists began their slow, disciplined work. Each fragment became a witness. Carbon dating would anchor them in the right century. Chemical traces buried in the bone could reveal diet, illness, or even faraway birthplaces. Under microscopic lenses, details too faint for the naked eye promised clues about how these people lived and what their final days might have looked like. Piece by piece, the bones became more than remains. They became evidence. They became stories. The age patterns surfaced first, and they hit with weight. Most of the collection came from adults, but a troubling number belonged to the young. Some were barely into adolescence. Others were toddlers, children who had seen only a few winters. True, the 18th century was a harsh era, and childhood death touched nearly every home. But this basement wasn't a churchyard, and these bones didn't follow the path of natural loss. They clustered in one place, in one hidden pit, tied to one unknown purpose. These young lives had been part of something clandestine, something conducted out of sight, and the bones themselves confirmed it. Under magnification, incision patterns told their own story. This was a calm, deliberate, and unmistakably surgical. Joints had been separated cleanly, not hacked apart. Identical cuts appeared across specimen after specimen, the signature of someone trained, someone following a set method. Several long bones showed precise saw marks where the interior had been exposed on purpose. This wasn't violence. This wasn't panic. This was instruction, an anatomy lesson carried out in secret. The skulls expanded the case. Circular drill holes pierced several of them. True trepanation in appearance, but unmistakably post-mortem. No signs of healing, no signs of pain endured. The procedures happened after death, and the reason pointed toward practice. Someone refining the delicate skills required for cranial surgery, rehearsing on the dead before operating on the living. More signs piled on. Some bones showed traces of maceration, the intentional cleaning of remains to prepare them for study. Others had been cracked in controlled ways to demonstrate break patterns. A few even carried faint numbers or markings, evidence of cataloging and repeated use. This wasn't a crime scene in the modern sense. It was a hidden classroom. Investigators found no signs of perimortem injury, no defensive wounds, no fatal blows, no indicators of murder. These individuals had likely died from the ordinary tragedies of their age: disease, childbirth, accidents, and the relentless hardships of life before modern medicine. Their bodies hadn't been killed for this purpose. They had been used after, which led to the inevitable conclusion. This basement had never been an execution chamber. It had been an illicit anatomy theater, a secret training ground operating beneath a respectable London home. But revelation only opened new doors. Where had the bodies come from? Who transported them here? And most unsettling of all, how did Benjamin Franklin's London residence become the silent host of a shadowed medical enterprise? A secret school in plain sight. The truth never surfaced in the bones at all. It slept in long-ignored archives where brittle pages waited for someone patient enough to listen. When researchers began stitching together old property ledgers, private letters, and yellowed newspaper notices, each fragment pointed unmistakably toward one name: William Hewson, the gifted anatomist who lived at 36 Craven Street during the exact years Benjamin Franklin occupied the rooms above. In 1772, at 32 and already renowned, William turned the house into the headquarters of his work. His experiments on blood and the lymphatic system pushed medical understanding far beyond what most physicians of the era could grasp. His discoveries in coagulation would one day crown him the father of hematology. Yet the revelation that mattered most was simpler, sharper, and impossible to deny. William ran an anatomy school inside those very walls. Advertisements in London newspapers announced his lectures and practical sessions, drawing students and surgeons willing to pay high fees for skills the universities could not legally provide. Hands-on work with human bodies. And that was the problem. 18th century British law kept a vice grip on cadaver supply. Only the bodies of executed criminals could be dissected, barely a dozen a year for all of London. A laughably small number for a city training its medical future. The Murder Act of 1752 meant each dissection carried a stain of moral punishment, deepening public disgust and making reform almost unthinkable. Meanwhile, surgery was advancing, techniques were sharpening, and anatomy had become too important to leave to outdated laws. The gap between need and legality created a thriving underground trade fueled by resurrection men who slipped into graveyards at night and sold freshly stolen bodies to anatomy schools. Everyone in medicine knew the system existed. Some pretended not to. Others defended it as an ugly but necessary engine of progress. William, like his colleagues in London and Edinburgh, bought cadavers from these secret suppliers. Deliveries came after dark through the back. Dissections took place in locked rooms. And afterward came the question every anatomist faced: where to hide the remains without risking discovery. Craven Street solved it neatly. The house allowed discreet arrivals, complete privacy, and enough space for work that could never survive daylight. William lived there with his wife, free to conduct research without interruption, and the pit beneath the basement became the simplest answer to a constant dilemma: disposing of bodies with no trace left behind. But the work carried dangers that no law could rival. Only 2 years after founding his school, William suffered a dissection wound that proved fatal, a reminder that the risks of anatomy were as immediate as they were unavoidable. Franklin left London the following year, returning to America as Revolution approached. Ownership of the property shifted, the basement was sealed, and time rolled over everything, quietly preserving what lay below. 2 centuries later, restoration workers opened the floor, and the story that had slept beneath one of history's most recognizable addresses finally returned to the light. The bones that spoke. When bones surfaced in the basement beneath a founding father's former residence, the discovery demanded explanation. The bones themselves would have to speak. Under forensic scrutiny, they revealed something chilling. Deliberate cut marks, precise incisions following patterns unmistakable to any trained eye as surgical dissection. This was no scene of violence, no panicked concealment of murder. The cuts were methodical, purposeful, educational. Someone with intimate knowledge of human anatomy had worked here, teaching others the secrets hidden beneath skin and muscle. The trail led directly to William, a brilliant anatomist operating a private medical school within these very walls. Yet William was far from ordinary. Medical circles knew him as a rising luminary, celebrated for groundbreaking research into the lymphatic system's mysteries. Still, the human remains represented merely the beginning of what lay waiting in that shadowed basement. Scattered among the human bones, investigators uncovered animal remains. Sheep, pigs, cattle, each bearing identical methodical markings. Sharp, precise incisions traced along femurs and tibias. Skulls had been carefully opened, their cranial vaults removed with surgical precision that spoke of practiced hands. These specimens aligned perfectly with William's documented experiments comparing human and animal blood circulation. The evidence deepened. Chemical traces permeating the soil revealed substances matching preservation techniques from anatomical studies of that era. Mercury compounds in lime, the residue of scientific inquiry. More damning still, William's own research notebooks referenced these exact materials. The picture crystallized, a clandestine anatomy school hidden behind walls of respectability. Yet one question remained, darker and more troubling than all the rest. What did Benjamin Franklin know? Where Benjamin Franklin fits in. Every morning, Benjamin climbed those stairs, moved through corridors, ate meals, and slept peacefully above a hidden world where bones lay scattered in the darkness below. He thrived daily atop the remains of an anatomical school, walking floors that separated his bed from human skeletons. Yet one question haunted the historical record. Did he know? Nearly 16 years passed between 1757 and 1775. Years Benjamin spent renting rooms on the upper floors, while representing colonial interests in London. During those identical years, directly below and beside where Benjamin slept and worked, William was conducting dissections that would revolutionize medical science forever. How could Benjamin possibly have remained unaware? The relationship binding these two men makes any simple answer impossible. Benjamin wasn't merely William's landlord or distant neighbor sharing walls. He was William's friend, his intellectual mentor in crucial ways, and ultimately, through William's marriage to Mary Stevenson, the daughter of Benjamin's own landlady, they became family. This transformation made William both his protege and something resembling a son-in-law, particularly since Benjamin himself had actively encouraged the marriage and deeply admired William's scientific mind. Benjamin attended the wedding ceremony. He wrote warmly of William in letters, praising his intellect and scientific achievements extensively. So when William died young from an infection contracted during a dissection, Benjamin mourned him genuinely. Benjamin's own credentials in science were formidable beyond question. He had unlocked the secrets of electricity, mapped the Gulf Stream, and invented devices that improved daily life substantially. He believed passionately in the advancement of knowledge, in pushing past ignorance toward understanding every natural mystery. Anatomy was simply another frontier, another mystery demanding investigation through careful study. So would a man of such scientific curiosity, living in a house where anatomical research was actively conducted, remain deliberately ignorant of what was happening beneath his feet? Most historians believe the answer is no with considerable certainty. Benjamin likely knew. Perhaps not every detail, perhaps not every acquisition of a specimen, but he would have understood the general nature of William's work clearly. Benjamin was intensely curious about science and medicine, and he and William discussed scientific matters regularly, their correspondence showing mutual respect and intellectual exchange throughout. But there exists no evidence, no letter, no diary entry, and no testimony that he participated in obtaining the bodies or the dissections himself directly. He was approaching 70 during those years, more focused on politics and diplomacy than on surgical training or medical practice. But knowing and approving? That seems far more probable than ignorance or complete unawareness. His presence was circumstantial at most when examined carefully. He happened to live in a house where illegal but scientifically valuable work occurred, and in the moral calculus of the time, many Enlightenment thinkers, including Benjamin, might have viewed anatomical education as justifiable despite its legally questionable supply chain. Progress required knowledge, knowledge required study, and study required bodies from somewhere. The question shifts then from whether Benjamin knew to how he reconciled that knowledge with his public persona as moral authority. The man who wrote eloquently about liberty and human dignity also lived above a pit of bodies obtained through means that violated the law and arguably violated the dignity of the dead individuals. This tension reveals something profound about the era itself. Science and ethics existed in separate spheres without intersection, and brilliant minds could hold both progressive ideals and troubling compromises simultaneously without apparent conflict. The ethical puzzle. What happened at Craven Street cannot be understood without first grasping how desperately 18th century Britain thirsted for forbidden knowledge, knowledge locked inside human flesh. The law drew a brutal line. Only murderers, freshly executed, could legally surrender their bodies to the anatomist's blade. This was punishment beyond the gallows, a final humiliation where death offered no escape from violation. In any given year, perhaps 10 such bodies emerged to educate hundreds of medical students scattered across the entire nation. The equation was impossible from the start. Surgeons stood at a terrible crossroads, aching to decode the human form, to map where arteries branched, how organs meshed together, what invisible threshold separated a beating heart from stillness, yet they confronted a starvation of specimens. Books and illustrations offered shadows of truth, but nothing approached the revelation of parting ribs, following blood's intricate highways, cradling the humid weight of human viscera. Without this tactile education, they would grope blindly through operations, repeat fatal errors, and watch patients slip away from ignorance that direct observation could have conquered. So they shattered the law and secured bodies through whatever channels presented themselves. These specimens arrived through pathways twisted with moral ambiguity, each route corrupted differently. Resurrection men prowled cemeteries after midnight. Professional thieves who traded in the newly buried. Families drowning in poverty sometimes sold their deceased relatives for coins that might buy another week of survival. Workhouses and hospitals yielded the unclaimed, bodies belonging to souls who died in isolation, no one left to object to their appropriation. In virtually every instance, the dead had granted no permission to become objects of study. Their wishes evaporated with their final exhalation. William and others like him constructed elaborate justifications rooted in practical philosophy. Certainly, they violated statutes. Certainly, they trampled sacred boundaries surrounding death and bodily integrity. But their transgressions, they argued, were purchasing future salvation, countless lives rescued by surgical mastery honed on these nameless corpses. The basement specimens embodied, from their perspective, an unfortunate necessity for humanity's advancement. One person's desecration weighed against society's greater welfare. But examine whose desecration was being tolerated. These bodies weren't selected randomly. They emerged overwhelmingly from society's periphery, the destitute, the condemned, the unmourned. Individuals blessed with wealth and family protection never materialized on dissection slabs. This pattern exposed an uncomfortable reality about whose flesh was deemed disposable, whose personhood could be erased to serve scientific ambition. Progress evidently demanded its tribute from specific populations. Enlightenment marched forward across the surrendered bodies of those powerless to protest. The bigger story. The remains beneath Benjamin's floor could be dismissed as a footnote, a strange curiosity attached to a famous name. But they represent something far larger, a window into the brutal truth that drove scientific progress during an era when knowledge and ethics had not yet learned to speak the same language. Walk through the basement today, converted now into a museum, and you can stand where those bones were buried. The pit has been excavated, documented, and resealed with plaques explaining what was found, why it was there, and who William Hewson was. Visitors come expecting scandal around Benjamin's name and leave understanding something more complex. That progress often demands compromises we'd rather not examine too closely. The doctors who worked in that basement weren't monsters. They were ambitious, driven by genuine curiosity about how bodies functioned. They wanted to heal, to teach, and to push back against the ignorance that made surgery little more than butchery. But their noble goals required them to transgress laws and social boundaries, to treat human remains as resources rather than sacred trusts. They couldn't achieve their aims through legal channels, so they chose illegal ones, believing that the end justified the means. In truth, and in outcome, history has largely agreed with them. The anatomical knowledge gained through illicit dissections transformed medicine, surgical mortality rates dropped, and doctors learned to diagnose internal conditions, to operate with precision, and to understand disease processes. The bodies buried at Craven Street contributed in their silent way to techniques that save lives every day in modern hospitals. Benjamin's presence in that house during those years reminds us that even great minds carry contradictions. The man who declared all men are created equal while owning enslaved people also lived above a pit of bodies taken without consent. These contradictions don't erase his achievements, but they complicate our understanding of him as a figure. Heroes are rarely simple. The bones beneath Benjamin Franklin's floor don't tell a story about crime. They tell a story about how human knowledge advances, sometimes heroically, sometimes shamefully, usually somewhere in the uncomfortable space between. They remind us that progress demands not just brilliance and dedication, but also difficult questions about whose sacrifice we're willing to accept in exchange for advancement. And they ask us to consider what future generations might discover about our own era's compromises, what hidden costs our progress might carry that we've chosen not to examine too closely. Sometimes the most valuable discoveries aren't answers, they're better questions. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.